Well, good evening. You guys like this image? This is why I like it too. I found it in the newspaper, and it turns out the Highway Department and the Montana Highway Patrol has had a long-standing hatred of drunk driving and speeders. And this actual image comes from the 1936 newspaper. So they've been doing it for a long time. There's other good ones like Drive Death Off the Highways. It has a Grim Reaper driving a jalopy and all kinds of great stuff. But I can't talk the Highway Patrol into putting them on t-shirts yet. So I'm still working on them. My name, again, is Jon Axline. I've worked for the Highway Department for 26 years, and I may say some things tonight that aren't very flattering to the department, but I just want you to know right off the bat that I've enjoyed every minute that I've worked there, and the people that work there have been great, and I'm very proud to be a member of that particular agency. So bear that in mind if I say something that isn't all that nice. The other part is I want to ask how many people out here worked for the Highway Department at one time? All right, good. Yes, you did work for the Highway Department. Yeah. So it's been, you know, a very important agency in Montana for over 100 years now. And a lot of what Montana is today is because we've had a good system of roads. And but the history behind a lot of that, I think, is really interesting. And so tonight I'll try to impart some of that. If you want to read the whole story, I guess you have to read my book. But if you get one, I'll be more than happy to sign it. I'm also working on one about the Beartooth Highway that should be out later on this year. So hopefully it'll be just as, I like it just as well as I like the other one. So with that, we'll get started. There we go. So you know what to look for when you go to the bookstore. Anybody know who this gentleman is? Some of you out there ought to know this guy. This is John Mullan, for which the person for whom the Mullen Road is named. Mullen is really the father of Montana's highways. He came to Montana in 1859, building a road between Walla Walla, Washington and Fort Benton. He spent a few years here in Montana. He was a big advocate of good transportation routes. In his case, it was wagon roads, almost to the point where people who knew him well couldn't stand being around him anymore because that's all he talked about. He was very self-centered as far as it went, and they said if you weren't for him, you were against him. So you can imagine he was probably a little annoying. But in the process, he built the first road across Montana, the first engineered road. And parts of that road still exist today. And a lot of our roads today follow the route of the Mullen Road. So not only did he build the first road, he also set the first alignment, the first route. And that route was well chosen in 1860 to the point where we're still driving parts of it today. Parts of the Mullen Road still exist. We kind of have to know where to look for it, but there are a lot of Mullen Road buffs out there who can tell you where to go look. Rich Buswell was a former doctor here in town, he's now retired, has been studying the Mullen Road for a long time. And actually I look to him as being the real authority on the route, but especially in the Helena area, but there are other segments of it that you can go visit. This is the Point of Rock segment. It's about 2 miles west of Alberton in Mineral County. And this segment was built in 1860. It's fairly well documented in Mullen's report to Congress in 1863. So we know that the trials and tribulations that he had building this segment along the mountainside up above the Clark Fork River. He also lied about it in the report to Congress. He says that you could drive a wagon through all the road cuts very easily and you could walk alongside the wagon as you did that. Well, in truth, they're much smaller than that. Most of the time you had to let the wagon go and you had to follow in behind it. They were that narrow. But at least along this section of the road, you can tell that happened. So we have really the best evidence on this particular segment, I think, of what that really actually took to build the Mullen Road in 1860. So, and again, you can go visit it if you want to. It's an unimproved hiking trail. It's owned by the Highway Department. that they acquired most of it during the interstate era for use as a gravel source. But this particular section went unchanged. And you can still walk it. We've got interpretive markers along it. And, but I would suggest you don't go in the spring. I'm not a big fan of ticks. And when I was walking this segment the last time in May of a couple of years ago, I was, if I was phobic, I'd be probably still there. I mean, I had never seen so many ticks in my life. And to the point where we were dragging them into the restaurant afterwards as well, and just flicking them off. So I haven't been back to that one since. There's other old road segments that are still very visible around Montana, and that's one of the great things about Montana is it's such a big state that we're pretty reliant on roads, and a lot of those roads are still there, and you can go still see them. This is the Bozeman Trail. This is a part of the segment from Virginia City to Bozeman, and in fact this segment is right up above Virginia City today, and you could drive up to it and you can walk up a ways. In fact, you can walk it all the way to Norris if you really wanted to. But this is a typical segment on the Bozeman Trail at that part. There are also other segments of the trail in eastern Montana that you can go visit, but a lot of those unfortunately cross private land, so you can't get very good access to it. The old road between Bannock and Virginia City still exists. It's called Road Agents Trail. It's all been documented by historians. We know exactly where it went and what was along it. And of course, as many of you know, this is the trail where Henry Plummer's road agents would lie in wait for the wagons and stagecoaches leaving mining camps with the men carrying gold and waylaying them along the way. Other segments are still there as well, but they're also underneath modern roads. So how many of you are from Billings or know the Billings area very well? A few of you have been on Alkali Creek Road as part of the old road between Colson and Fort Benton. And that's where this particular photo was taken in the 1870s. That was an extremely important freight route between the two ports, one being Colson on the Yellowstone and Fort Benton on the Missouri. And so the route saw quite a bit of traffic, and part of that road became a modern Billings street. It still runs down Alkali Creek to this day. In fact, my parents live overlooking this. If you kind of look over towards just to the right of where that haystack is, that they live on the cliffs overlooking this particular road. Then it all changed. 1888. What had happened by 1888? Anybody have any idea? I also teach, so I kind of feel compelled to do this. Ask questions and make sure everybody's listening, or awake, more importantly. Railroad had arrived by then. By then we had the Utah Northern had arrived in 1881, the Northern Pacific in 1883, and then the Montana Central and the Manitoba Railroad were here by 1887. So that really changed the way transportation developed in Montana, because no longer were you really reliant on a lot of those old roads that had developed before. That a lot of people, instead of riding on stagecoaches, wisely chose the railroads instead. Stagecoaches were no fun, and when they went away, pretty much nobody really lamented their loss. They were the most uncomfortable things to ride in. It took you a long time to get anywhere, and it was expensive to get there. So stagecoach travel kind of faded out after the railroads arrived, and in favor of the lines. But one thing that also happened because of that was that it allowed the importation of steel. Before that, it was hard to bring steel to Montana because it took a long time by wagon, and you were kind of limited by what the wagons could carry. But the railroads could bring steel out. And so in 1888, a group of Fort Benton businessmen banded together to form a company to build the old steel bridge that's up in Fort Benton today. And that is the oldest bridge that still exists in Montana. And it is the first steel bridge that was built in Montana as well. And for the most part, it's still intact. The section closest to Fort Benton had a swing span originally, but in 1908, a flood washed it out. And so it's had a span attached to that end now that came from the old 15th Street Bridge in Great Falls. So that's really the last remnant of that large truss bridge that once existed there. But this bridge really allowed Fort Benton to kind of put the days of the steamboat behind them. They did have a railroad connection, and this bridge allowed them access to the Judith Basin country during the height of the cattle industry. So this is probably the most historic bridge in Montana, and fortunately for us, it still exists. And I hear that there's a movement afoot to do some work on it to upgrade it. Well, not upgrade it so much as to make repairs to it and make it look a little better. But then again, things change again. One thing about transportation is things are always changing. And I kind of blame the engineers for that because they like to see things change. And so it's all their fault. But usually it changes for the better, so I'm more than okay with that. But automobiles really hit Montana about the first years of the 20th century. And but after that, the whole road system really changed. How you built them, what the standards were for roads, how you drained water off of them, what kind of surfacing you had, that type of thing was all developed to make automobile traffic much easier for citizens, just everyday people like you and I. And so really by World War I, there is a real big push in the department to do a lot more work on roads, but a lot of that's being done because of the petitioning of automobile groups to get better roads. A lot of that early road well, let me back up. 1913, the state legislature formed the Montana State Highway Commission. It was mostly an advisory body. They didn't really have any money to build roads. They just mainly gave advice to the counties. And it was also their job to put together the first Montana highway map, which I believe they have upstairs, don't they, Brian? They should. It should be a copy of it up there. I just finally got a slide of it yesterday, or else I would have added it into here. But so that was really their job. You give advice and you put together a highway map. And then in 1915, they got some direction from the legislature to form a bridge department. And that bridge department standardized bridge designs so the counties could all use the same type of bridge whatever situation they needed it. But because they were advisory, again, they had a $5,000 a year budget, which isn't really enough to do anything. They had 3 highway commissioners, and only one of them was a paid official, and then they had a stenographer. So really the first woman that worked at the highway department started her job in 1913. So fortunately, we've got a lot more women at the department now than they did in 1913, including a lot of female engineers, which, 26 years ago, there was hardly any at all in the department. But one thing the Highway Commission could do was buy equipment for the state prison. And really the most experienced road builders in Montana up until the 1920s were prison convicts. That there was a fairly active convict road group that was active in Montana starting in 1910, and they really gained some momentum in 1913 with the Highway Department, or Highway Commission, excuse me. And so the first real construction of modern roads in Montana was done by prison convicts, which I think is really important. It was a good way, the warden thought, to rehabilitate prisoners by getting them out of the prison itself and putting them to work doing, essentially honest work. Some kind of work that they could take with them when they got out and use once they got out of prison. So there were about 200 miles of convict-built roads, mostly in western Montana. There's 2 segments of convict road that you can still go visit today. One is, I would only recommend with the high clearance 4-wheel drive vehicle, and that's along the west side of the Yellowstone River through Yankee Jim Canyon. It was built by convicts in 1913. And then a little road just off of the Shields Valley, north of the Yellowstone River, called Convict Grade, about a few miles west or east of Livingston, is also still, there is a convict-built road that you can drive today and still see the work that they did in the rocks up above the road, which is really unusual. I mean, most of the work that they've done has completely been obliterated by more recent road construction. But in 1917, things changed. 1917, the legislature, acting in response to the first Federal Aid Road Act in 1916, actually gave the Highway Commission a little bit more power in the construction of roads. So they did that by doing away with the three-man Highway Commission, and instead they had a 12-man Highway Commission. How many of you try to do things by committee? It's really hard, isn't it? But they did figure out a way to get around that. And so there was 3 men of that 12-man commission that were actually, they were called an executive committee. And those 3 men were actually the men that made all the decisions. And so the rest of the highway commissioners just met 2 or 3 times a year to kind of green light whatever the executive committee had already done. But the 1916 Road Act gave the highway department $1.5 million of federal funds that had to be matched by state funds, which mostly came from the counties. And what the legislation also stipulated was that Highway Commission would do all the plans for the roads. They would oversee the bidding process. They would have a project engineer on site during construction, and then they would have to provide the okay to the counties when the project was over with before they could pay the contractors. So it really gave us a lot more power than we had before, but we were still hampered by the counties. I mean, it wasn't the state that was providing the matching funds for federal funds, it was the counties that were doing that. So it was really the counties still had the upper hand. And that really was a big problem because the highway commissioners felt, and I think rightfully so, is that they really couldn't build a true interstate highway system that were connected, Montana's highways connected with roads in other states, as long as that particular system was in effect. And so there were a lot of complaints in the Highway Commission meeting minutes from about 1917 up until 1921 about how ineffective this particular process was. But actually, I think it was a little bit more effective than they were giving it the credits for. 1919, after the war, they got a surplus of war equipment, or surplus war equipment the Highway Department got. The Highway Department was formed in 1919 for the most part. And they got all this road construction equipment from the federal government. And really it's because of this new system and that equipment that road building in Montana really took off starting in 1919. Now the first project that they oversaw the construction of was called the Black and White Trail. Does anybody know where that was at? That was really the first attempt to try and build a highway over the Beartooth Mountains to Cook City. And it just got to the top of Mount Maurice outside of Red Lodge, and they ran out of funds. There was a new Federal Aid Highway Act in 1921, and that pretty much killed that project, but you can still see that route going up the side of Mount Maurice if you know where to look. It's still there as well. But importantly, in 1919, the only experienced road builders in Montana were prison convicts. And so really road contracting was really a new profession beginning in 1919. And a lot of these guys had no experience building roads. They didn't follow the plans very well. They didn't follow directions very well. And so there was a lot of animosity between the highway department and the road contractors for a good part of the 1920s. And it's all because I think they're trying to kind of find their way. Both sides are trying to figure out exactly how this system is going to work and learn how to build a good road. So this photograph was taken up in Fergus County, a road project up there north of Lewistown, and this is the son of the highway contractor on that particular project. I have no idea what this little boy's name is, but importantly, a lot of these contractors brought their families with them. So we do have a fair number of photographs of highway contractors with their families on these particular projects, and some of these projects were out in the middle of nowhere. And so I think it's really interesting that that it happened that particular way. A lot of the early roads built were between industrial sites. This is the road between Bear Creek in Carbon County and Red Lodge, which was a strategically important route up until until about the 1930s. So if you look at this, you know, most of the work is being done by horsepower. It's still, for the most part, pick and shovel work, and that road still exists today too as Secondary 308. And if any of you are aware of coal mining history in Montana, the mine that's in the background is the Smith Mine. And the trestle that's leading over towards the road is the one that goes to the tunnel where the Smith Mine disaster happened in 1943. But again, it's mostly horse-powered pick and shovel work. It's hard work. There's not a whole lot of real professional supervision of a lot of these workers. So how these roads turned out was kind of iffy. None of the projects got done on time in the early 1920s. There was a lot of complaints about that they were costing more than they should have, and they weren't getting done when they were supposed to. And so it got to the point where in the early 1920s, they were going to need to do something else to really make an efficient nationwide road system. This, by the way, is on the road between Billings and Roundup. Well, it always helps when you have a tough guy in charge. This guy looks pretty tough, doesn't he? And he was also pretty mean. Yeah, this is Frank Conley. Frank Conley was the warden of the state penitentiary for a good part of the early 20th century. He was a tough man. He was hard to get along with, I understand. He was fair, though, and he had a real vision in mind of what the highway department should be doing. And so a lot of what he did in the late 1910s and early 1920s really set the pace, set the standard for what the highway department would do up until the 1930s. He was also the one that was overseeing the Convict road crews before he became a highway commissioner. So if you kind of think about it, there was definitely a conflict of interest here because he was being paid kickbacks up until 1921 through the Highway Commission to build roads, while considering that while he was still the head of the Highway Commission in Helena. So it's a little iffy, and he did get caught on it in 1921, and he was forced to resign from both that, the Highway Commission, and the state prison. But we owe Frank Conley a lot, despite that kind of questionable business practices that he was following. 1921, there was a passage of a new Federal Highway Act, and this particular act gave even more money to the states for building roads. And it also established what they call the 7% system. And the 7% system was 7% of the total mileage in each state. Montana had about 4,500 miles of federal aid highway based on that. And most of the major highways today, like the route following Interstate 90, I-15 and all that, were established under the 7% system in the early 1920s. But because they had a little bit more money, they had a little bit more authority to build roads, that you really see starting in 1921, 1922, an explosion in the amount of road construction going on in Montana. A lot more heavy equipment than before, especially things like this. Some things like these Nash quads, which were war surplus trucks that were called petrol-eating dinosaurs. They were very hard to steer, didn't get very good traction, very heavy. It was like that whole idea of Armstrong steering, if you don't have magnified with Nash quads like this one. There was also equipment like this. This is called an Iowa striper. There were some paved highways in Montana in the early 1920s, around Bozeman and also between Butte and Anaconda. So this is how they striped paved highways. By this guy sitting on this cart attached to the car going backwards down the road. So this was an OSHA nightmare. And I always felt sorry, I hate to be the guy sitting on the cart when the other one's driving down the road and not knowing what's going on behind you as you're heading down the road. But in the process, they built better roads. Some were better, I'll put it that way. Most of them were surfaced with earth still. Sometimes they would use scoria. In eastern Montana, there was a few concrete paved roads, but not very many. Most of them are dirt surfaced, maybe a little bit of gravel. but it was enough to really cause people to get out and enjoy the roads a little bit more in their automobiles. So this photo was taken on the east side of McDonald Pass, about 1921, 1922, that you see a lot all of a sudden in the newspapers and in other places about outings that people took on the weekends in their jalopies. But the roads weren't all that great in some places. This is US Highway 87 up in Fergus County. This is what they call the Custer Battlefield Highway. So you can imagine what this road looked like when it got wet. They didn't do a lot of maintenance on them after they built the roads because they didn't have the money to do that. And so you got kind of what you got. And this is what you got. This is US 87 up by Big Sandy. I don't know if a lot of the cars we have today could negotiate this, but it sure looks like that Model T is doing all right in it. But still, it was enough that people complained about the lack of good roads in Montana. And indeed, by 1926, Montana had the reputation of having the worst highways in the United States. And a lot of that was because of the inability of the Highway Commission to get along very well with the counties on how the money should be spent on road construction, among other things, including the lack of any real standards that would work very well all over Montana instead of just certain parts of it. And so you got roads like this. Now, part of the problem is the Highway Commission doesn't have the authority to make a lot of the decisions it needs to make because the matching money is still coming from the counties. So the counties are really the decision makers in this whole process. They're telling the Highway Commission where they want the money spent. It's not the other way around. It got to the point by 1926 that the Highway Department turned back federal funds because they couldn't match them from the counties. And there was some real discussions about shutting down the department altogether because they seemed to be, in their minds, pretty much ineffective in this whole process. But a group of good roads enthusiasts around Montana, headed by a man named Oliver S. Warden. Anybody heard that name before? O.S. Warden was the publisher of the Great Falls Tribune. He was a very influential man in the good roads movement in Montana beginning in the 1920s. And so he was able to work with the Highway Commission and really unite all these various different good roads groups into really pushing for a gasoline tax in Montana. So in 1926, the voters of Montana voted in the first gasoline tax. And the way that that process was set up was that the counties were now all of a sudden out of it. That the Highway Department itself had the money to match federal funds, and the Highway Department could decide how that money was going to be spent and where it was going to be spent. So that really changed the way that roads were built in Montana in the late 1920s. And so that's, I think, a very important milestone legislation on the part of the state to vote that in. And it seems though even through the Great Depression, there was never any problem about putting out referendum votes or whatever kind of votes to get people to raise the gasoline tax so that they would have more money to be able to match federal funds and do more work on the highways. So it really gives you an idea how important highways were to Montanans at that time. And from what I've seen in the Highway Commission records, there isn't a whole lot of complaining about it. There's virtually no condemnations on right-of-way. There are a few, but not very often. And during the Highway Commission meetings, you never get that many people in there that are complaining about something, other than the fact is they're not building roads fast enough. So I think that's a real important thing here for Montana, and again, the value that they placed on good highways. I mean, you're still going to have stuff like this for a while in northwestern Montana. And your roads are going to cause a lot of damage to your vehicles in the process. So take a look at this one and tell me which two people are married. I'd say the guy on the left is afraid of the woman on the right because she's sure staring daggers at him. Yeah, these other two people are kind of looking down like, well, maybe we should go somewhere else. But it was a quandary. How do you spend the money in the most efficient way where you got the biggest bang for your buck? So starting in 1931, what's going on in 1931? The Great Depression. The Great Depression is another one of those events in Montana history that was really seminal to transportation history, because mainly you've got a lot of men out of work, and what's the best way to put them back to work? Building roads. They don't have to have any skills. All they have to do is be able to work a pick and a shovel for the most part. If they're a farmer and they have a horse team, that they could make a little bit extra money on highway projects by having their teams pull scrapers like this one. But President Hoover and President Roosevelt enacted legislation that would improve public roads by putting more men to work, by pretty much getting rid of totally the whole idea of having to provide matching funds for the federal funds, mainly because the states couldn't provide the money, and so they provided it to the states as grants. And then eventually, as the 30s wore on, they just gave them the money, and it wasn't a grant at all. But in the process, they put a lot of people back to work building roads. A lot of this, the regulations of this legislation stated that you have to have a minimal amount of power equipment, mostly hand equipment, mostly pick and shovel men. You had to make the projects last as long as you possibly could, and each man was paid a set rate per hour, and you had to pay them once a week, and you couldn't pay them by check, you had to pay them in cash. So this is really a good way to provide some kind of stimulus in an economy that's really heading south, and also you get a good road in the process, right? It worked great in Montana. So through the 1930s, they improved about 4,000 miles of road. And most of those highways were paved in the 1930s. It's with the bituminous surfacing that's kind of like that old asphalt that we had on our playgrounds. Remember when we were young and they didn't need to have grass, that if you fell off the monkey barge, you hit the pavement? We were tougher then than our kids are now. It's that kind of pavement for the most part that's on our roads. But they built a lot of roads during the 1930s. They built a lot of bridges, and they really saw the change in Montana's highway system from being the worst in the United States to being among the very best by the time World War II started for the United States in 1941. I was working on a project, or ahead of a project, down in the Gallatin Valley. We were replacing the old Manhattan overpass. And I was looking around to make sure that we weren't going to be hitting any important cultural resources in the process. And I found a segment of highway that had been paved in the early 1930s. It was only about maybe 100 feet long, but I was so excited that I broke off chunks of the pavement and I brought it back so I could have our materials people analyze it to see what it was made of. But I still have chunks of it in my office, and people think I'm absolutely crazy that I would get so excited about pieces of asphalt, essentially. But I think it's pretty cool that and it's still leaking oil on my shelves and the whole works. But every time I kind of make jokes about, well, maybe they want to see our asphalt collection. But in my office, I really have one. I don't know, I'll just leave it when I retire. But again, they were paving roads, and they were still relying quite a bit on horsepower to build this, because it takes a lot more men to build roads, and you get a lot more men off the unemployment rolls in the process. This is US Highway 91, north of Helena, between here and Great Falls. This was a big project through Wolf Creek Canyon and then through Missouri River Canyon in the early 1930s. Before that, if you wanted to go to Great Falls from here, the quickest way was to go by the railroad. But if you were driving up there, you got up about Wolf Creek, and then you had to turn off and go up through Sims and Sun River to get to Great Falls. So this was really the first direct highway route between Helena and Great Falls, was US Highway 91. And you can still drive that highway today. If you want to get off the interstate at the south end of Wolf Creek Canyon and just take the frontage road all the way up to Great Falls, you can, in a lot of ways, feel what it felt like to drive an old 1930s highway. One thing I like about it is you can compare the methods of highway construction. Is if you watch on the frontage road, you really notice how the highway really follows the contours of the landscape. But if you get on the interstate, you'll notice very quickly that they made the landscape fit the interstate during the 1960s. It's a totally different philosophy of building roads. This curve on the highway between Phillipsburg and Anaconda is still there as you go up over the pass through Georgetown Lake to get to Anaconda. Jefferson Canyon route was the first road through Jefferson Canyon. That was kind of a big political mess for a little while. The Yellowstone Trail, old alignment of US Highway 10 used to go from Cardwell south through Jefferson Island, then over towards Harrison, and then back up to Three Forks. So this was the first direct route between Cardwell and Three Forks during the early 1930s. This was a make-work project on the part of Herbert Hoover's relief programs. But it had some other benefits as well, because what's along that route today that people might want to go see? Lewis and Clark Caverns. So that was really one of the big factors in the highway department making the decision to build this new road, was it would provide better access to Lewis and Clark Cavern for tourists. Because once you build a good highway, of course you're going to want people to use it, and tourism really becomes a big deal in the 1930s in the process because of that. Beartooth Highway was built between 1931 and 1936. For the most part, it's a federal make-work project. I mean, it was designed really to put people to work and provide a new entrance to Yellowstone National Park. So if you read the records on the Beartooth Highway, it's very interesting, the different interests that are at work in getting this highway built. And I think if we looked at it today, I don't think we'd build a road like this, would we? What would be the problem today? Mostly environmental issues. I mean, you couldn't build a road like either the Going to the Sun Highway or the Beartooth Highway in the early 21st century. Also built a lot of bridges. And this is really one of my favorite. This is the Yellowstone River Bridge at Fallon. I-94 goes right by it. This was a major project during World War II at a time when steel was really hard to get. But because US Highway 10 was a strategically important highway, the highway department was able to eventually get the steel to build the bridge to replace one that had washed out because of an ice jam. They had a hard time after that getting steel workers to work on it. Steel workers are where? They're all on the West Coast building ships, or else they're in the Army or they're in the military. So they used Crow Indian steel workers to build this bridge, which I think is pretty interesting as well. But most of the bridges like this, truss bridges built during the 1930s, especially after 1933, they looked like this type of bridge. So if you take the old recreation road north of Wolf Creek, you'll go over a bridge like this. And that was actually the first bridge of this design that was built in Montana in 1933, is that one at Wolf Creek. And that one's got kind of an interesting history as well, because you remember I said a little bit ago you had resident engineers, project engineers on these projects, right? They're employed by the highway department to kind of oversee the construction process and to make sure the contractor is following the plans. And we still have those we have those guys on our projects. But in 1933, this was a brand new bridge design. The engineers down in Helena, were very interested in that particular structure and how the construction was going on it. So they kept going up to the construction site to check it out, to the point where the contractor, a man named William Roscoe, finally wrote a letter to the chief bridge engineer, a man named Ben Ornburn, and said, you got all these spies that are coming up here to check out my work. And Ornburn, who was very prim and very proper, he wore spats, high-collared shirts all the time. He writes back to Roscoe and says, we never have spies on any of our projects. Well, Ornburn was out and out lying to Roscoe, and I think Roscoe probably knew that. Is, yeah, you have a spy there that's employed by the highway department to make sure you're following the plans. I mean, that's just the way it is. But I think it was very interesting that the interest the engineers, the bridge designers here in Helena were taking in that particular structure to the point where they were becoming a bother to the contractor who was trying to build it. So one thing I'll say about highway department guys, they get into their work and they want to see how it's going together, and they want to see what's going to happen afterwards and how it's going to function after the project's done. And if you're, and I've kind of picked that up from them over time as well. And not quite to the point of being a pain in the butt yet, but I'm working on it. I got 9 more years to do that. In 1941, the United States got involved in World War II, and that pretty much shut down road construction during the duration of the war. There was some maintenance going on, but not very much. There was a little bit of construction, but that construction was going on strategic highways. The most important place this was happening was on the road between Columbus and Nye, down in Stillwater County. And the reason being is that there was chrome mines operating in the Beartooth Mountains above Nye, and that chrome was really was a strategic material that was important to the war effort. So you had to keep the roads in good shape so you could get that ore out from the mines up to the processors or to the railroads for shipment. So there was some work going on there. There was that work on that bridge I just showed you a photo of. But importantly, what's going on during the war is an awful lot of planning for what's going to happen after the war. The Highway Commission and the Highway Department fully expected to be getting a lot more money when the war was completed. And they figured that because you wanted to keep the economy going so you didn't sink back into a depression like you had been involved in before the war. And so they were making plans that would have a long-lasting impact on how our transportation system developed afterwards and how we're using them today. In 1944, they pretty much established what the interstate system was going to be here in Montana. All the interstates that we're traveling today were first plotted out and routed in 1944. And so during the 1950s, most of the federal funds were going to those routes. And then, of course, in 1956 and afterwards, that was building entirely new highways along those routes that had been established in 1944. But there was an awful lot of road construction going on in other places as well. And the reason was that most of the highways and bridges that had been built during the 1930s had been allowed to kind of deteriorate during the war. And so they reinitiated a brand new highway program in 1945 that upgraded that system and replaced a lot of the bridges that had become obsolete and built better alignments for highways. If you drive down to Townsend, you can definitely see where the original Highway 12 alignment was next to the existing alignment. The best examples, I think, or one of the best examples is between Wolf Creek and Augusta. You can see it off to the side. And I know Marcella, one time driving back from Lewistown, we were noticing that right around Armington Junction, that you could see how that system had changed after World War II. This is on Highway 12 outside of Garrison, which they did a lot of improvement work on Highway 12 during those years. And some of that work was eventually flooded out, and you can see some of that evidence too in the roads as you're driving over to Garrison today. But again, in the process, we got an even better highway system. We got better asphalt treated surface roads, we got better alignments, and that fit in very nicely with that post-World War II building boom, or economic boom that swept the country. And one thing that's going to come out of that is tourism really booms in Montana after the war as well. So you have even more people coming to Montana. And a lot of the reason the roads were built the way they were is because commercial trucking had also become more important to the economy. So there's a lot of things going on after World War II that really have a big impact on our road system. But Fred Robinson Bridge, completed in 1959, provided a first connection between Lewistown and Malta, and the only bridge between Wolf Point and Fort Benton. So there's a 250-mile gap along the river that didn't have a bridge. And so the people in central Montana have been agitating for a bridge in that area since the 1920s. They finally got one in 1959. And this is, of course, the bridge is still there today, is the Fred Robinson Bridge. And they had a fairly large turnout to dedicate it. Which, Governor Aronson was the prime speaker. They had speakers from Canada. They had national people from the Bureau of Public Roads speaking. They had a lot of Montana politicians, state senators, and what have you. They roasted I don't know how many beeves in the process. They had people showing up in their boats. I mean, it was just, in their airplanes, it was just incredible, considering you know, how remote and isolated this particular area was, that this many people showed up to really demonstrate how important that bridge was to the development of that area. But in 1956, things change again. In June of 1956, Dwight Eisenhower signs the legislation creating the Interstate Highway system. And almost immediately, the Highway Department begins gearing up for the construction of essentially a brand new road system. And so they expand their services. They get an Interstate Highway Division. Part of it is housed here in the Historical Society for a little while. They have to expand on their Highway Department building, which is right kitty corner where the Department of Livestock is today. And they just recruited designers and engineers like crazy, planners, you name it. And so really the size of the department just mushroomed in the late 1950s. Originally they designed for 2-lane controlled access highways, except close to metropolitan areas where they would be 4-lane. But the big thing was controlled access. And that's really what got the department in a lot of trouble there for a while. A lot of people in Montana didn't understand what that meant. And so a friend of mine named Steve Kalogi talks quite a bit about controlled access. It doesn't have very much good to say a lot of the times about the people who didn't know what it was. That's what I always liked about Steve Kalogi. He always told it like it was. All right. So the interstate highway system, most of the first years were spent in the planning and design phase, acquiring right-of-way, which was really a major undertaking in itself, was getting the right-of-way for these things. And it wasn't until 1959 that the first work began on a interstate highway between Dillon and Lima in southwestern Montana. So the first interstate, if anybody asks you when you go to a party, it's between Dillon and Lima is where the first section was built. And ironically, the last section that was built was also built in that area in 1988. About that, somewhere thereabouts. So this sign, I used to love these signs when I was a kid because I liked watching the construction. I'm sure my father was cursing me for wanting to go even slower through these areas. But this was always a good sign for me because that meant I got to see the heavy equipment operating next to the roads. Again, a lot of construction going on, brand new alignments. It took a lot of work to get the right-of-way for it. They had especially a hard time getting right-of-way for the interstates through the Yellowstone Valley between Livingston and Big Timber. Was really one of the first highway projects was in that area. And one of my favorite interstate-related features is there as well that my wife, I think, has gotten tired of hearing about every time we go to Billings, is the Springdale Cut above the Yellowstone River. Was a huge road cut for the interstate, and one that got us in a lot of political trouble with the legislature as well, because a lot of the legislatures couldn't understand why we were building something like that for the interstates that we were building. It was too big. The worst example is Senator Ben Stein from Livingston was our most active opponent. He hated the chief engineer, Fred Quinnell Jr., and Quinnell hated Stein quite a bit, to the point where if you went into Quinnell's office in the highway department, he supposedly had a big picture of Ben Stein hanging on his wall that he would throw darts at. And so I've got a photograph of Ben Stein sitting at Quinnell's desk with his feet up on the desk, and I always wondered if that picture with the darts in it is sitting there across from where he's sitting at that desk. So this photo was taken at the Springdale Cut down in the Yellowstone Valley. Out in eastern Montana, there was quite a bit of construction. It was a little bit easier in some respects to build road out there because the right-of-way prices were a little bit less and a lot more space to work in. And then the big project, which is my favorite about reading about, has been the segment through Wolf Creek Canyon here north of Helena. That was, at the time, the most expensive interstate project. It was superseded shortly after that by the Homestake Pass project. But there was an awful lot in the Helena newspapers about this particular segment, about people who were traveling between Great Falls and Helena who had to sit and wait for the blasting to occur before they could proceed on, and the fact that the newspaper wasn't very good about warning people when this was going to occur. And so there was a lot of complaints in the newspaper about it. But it was a major undertaking. It took a few years to get it done. And there was all kinds of worries that it was going to destroy the scenic attributes of the canyon. Yeah. Ben Stein tried to get it through the legislature that they couldn't award projects through the canyon for a while because he was afraid that the fisheries were going to suffer. And so what he was advocating was we had abandoned several miles of interstate that cost well over $4 million to build. And so as you can imagine, that didn't get very far, especially when Senator Charles Bovee got involved. So Bovee was one of our friends. And so a lot of political fallout on this, but also the engineering aspects of this particular segment of road is just fascinating to me. And I think it's been interesting lately just to watch the work that they're doing up there to scale off some of the rocks that have kind of overhung the interstate for the last 40 years, or all 50 years, I guess. So it's kind of been an ongoing project since the early 1960s. And then, of course, you build these things, you got to have a ceremony to open them. And we were really good about having these kind of ceremonies. And the lady on the right, that's Miss Montana Highways. I think you remember this. You don't remember this? All right. In the early 1970s, the engineers were looking for a good way to attract public attention. So for a few years in the early 70s, there was a Miss Montana Highways contest at the Highway Department. And different departments would nominate one of their employees as Miss Montana Highways. And I was looking through a file cabinet of stuff I got that somebody had found in the basement. And sure enough, I have a huge file on Miss Montana Highways. I've got all the headshots. And I've got all it was like Playboy used to be, where they'd have, you know, all the specifications, except for the measurements. They didn't do that. But it was just interesting because, you know, the time I've been at the department, there's no way you could do anything like that. You know, and in fact, it turns out that the reason we're not doing it is for the exact same reasons I kind of figured. Somebody complained. And so they eventually dropped it, I think, in 1973 or 1974. But I've got this great memo from Lewis Chittum, who was the chief engineer at the time, to one of his employees in the public information office, a lady, and I can't remember her name offhand, saying we need to get more people to come to the open house, so you need to advertise that we have women. We have good-looking women here in miniskirts. I met Lewis Chittum, and it was a little bit hard for me to picture that he would say something like that. But anyway, for a few years in the early 1970s, we had a Miss Montana Highways. One of them just recently died. I would like to find a couple of the other ones and just talk to them about this whole experience for them. Because if you see photos of interstate dedications from that time, there's a Miss Montana Highway in each one of them. And they were really, you know, in some ways an important figurehead for the department. So, but this is what we got. We've got an interstate system that's, I believe, a little over 1,200 miles. In Montana, it might be a little bit more than that. It's 4-lane. They were originally built as 2-lane controlled access. In the mid-1960s, President Johnson, bowing to pressure from different special interest groups, said that no, we're going to start building 4-lane controlled access highways instead. So a lot of the work that we'd done up until then, we had to go back and build another 2 lanes onto them to make them go. I remember the road outside of, the interstate outside of Butte was 2-lane when I was a little kid. And then up around Great Falls, it was 2-lane in some parts as well. So I'm sure some of you must remember when there was a lot more 2-lane roads than I do. But the interstate system has really had a profound impact on Montana. And I think a lot of people don't like the system very well, but in all actuality, I'd rather drive the interstate sometimes than the 2-lane roads. They're a lot safer. They're designed for 70, 75 mile an hour design speed, and I just like them better. in a lot of ways. And I still think you get to see a lot of the country as well. You just don't get to go through all the small towns in the process. So the system really has had a big impact on Montana. It's one that I don't think we've really accurately assessed yet. And I think that won't happen probably for a little while yet. And it's an ongoing system. I mean, it's still a live system. We're still making changes to it, and we can also see the impact that that system has had on communities like Helena, you know, as they grow out towards the interchanges instead of being focused more towards the downtown areas. So it's, and they weren't built for military reasons, which I thought was pretty interesting. I'd read in several places that, that it was built primarily for commercial truck traffic, not so much for the military, although they have to meet military standards so they can move equipment along them. So with that, I was always told that you should end a presentation with a dog. This is the newest addition to our family, Sophie the Corgi, who I figured I had to get her in there because my prior subject of photographs had passed away last year, and I had to get somebody else cute in there as well. So anyway, with that, I think I did it pretty well, Kirby, didn't I? I kept within the hour.